The idea of this conference yesterday and today is to take a closer look at two areas we think are very important in the Indo-Pacific: the security, which we talked about yesterday, and the global commons: ocean health, blue economy, climate change, maritime governance and law, and so forth. And today, I'm really delighted that we're going to be taking up a question which I think doesn't get as much attention as the security issues does. So the main question that we're going to be looking at, as you know, is whether this area can serve as a building block for even more US-India collaboration in the Indo-Pacific, and specifically if this cooperation, these issues can serve as the basis for building institutions. In recent years, US and India have been much more active on defense and security, keeping in mind the rise of China and a common challenge there. In the case of the commons, there would seem to be a great deal of potential to collaborate bilaterally and more broadly in the region. And today, we will turn to issues like blue economy and maritime law and governance. And we wonder whether these efforts can or should be or can be translated to more lasting institutional structures. And also, is it better for India and the US to take the lead on these things or to be more of a helper and assist in these efforts? And again, we are not starting with the assumption that one or the other is better or preferred, i.e., the formal or the informal approach. We want to hear what the speakers have to say about that and why they think that. Another question that we have in mind is to consider which analytical framework in international relations people see as most useful for themselves when they're trying to understand or explain US-India collaboration. Do they find realism, liberalism, or norms-based approaches more helpful? And this is something that we as academics and we as students, of course, grapple with a lot. But I think sometimes even outside analysts have this different lens in their mind when they're looking at these issues. So that said, it's now my great pleasure to introduce another excellent group of experts for this panel today. We had a very, very productive conversation yesterday, and I know that we'll have a repeat performance here today. So this one is on the regional architecture for the commons in the Indo-Pacific. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you. And let me now turn to my introductions for them. First of all, we're going to start with Jason Donofrio, who is a senior member of the Ocean Foundation in Washington, D.C., although we're not near any oceans, Jason. But he also serves as the chair of the Development for the Climate Strong Islands Network. And Jason is going to start off by talking about the prospects for the blue economy, as well as the pressing problems of ocean pollution and sustainability. He has a lot of practical knowledge on these issues, given his work at the Ocean Foundation, done some fascinating work, which I'm sure he'll share with us. He will then be followed by Cornell Overfield. I hope, Cornell, you've been able to join us by now. He is an expert on international law at the Center for Naval Analysis in Washington, D.C. He has written extensively on U.S. strategy, international maritime law, including in the Bay of Bengal and on Arctic affairs. So a lot of good material on the commons. And I've asked Cornell to give his views on how some of the challenges over the commons in the Indo-Pacific can be met via maritime governance and maritime law, even in areas where there might not be a complete meeting of the minds on some issues like blue economy and economic development. So following these presentations, we will hear from our expert, one of the leading experts in India, Abhijit Singh, who is a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, where he directs the Maritime Policy Initiative. Abhijit is a former naval officer with frontline command experience who is now very involved in writing about maritime affairs. So he really brings two extremely important expertise together. And in fact, I think he's one of the few people I know who can speak very knowledgeably on maritime governance, security, blue economy, anything to do with maritime. Abhijit is the person to go to. So he's the perfect commentator, I think, for us. And he'll give his own views each for about 12 to 15 minutes. And then we'll have a discussion in the panel with myself. And then I'll open it up to Q&A. And I just want to say one thing about the questions. Please do keep them short and to the point, and also on the topic. So better chance that I'll take your questions then. And then following the panel, we will have some valedictory remarks from Christ Pro Vice Chancellor Father Joes, who is himself a maritime history expert. So I look forward to all of your comments. And now, Jason, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are today in the world. Dr. Deepa, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. And thank you everyone at George Washington University for this great opportunity. My name is Jason Donofrio. I'm the External Relations Officer for the Ocean Foundation. We are a community foundation exclusively devoted to the ocean and coastal communities based in Washington, D.C. This year, we're celebrating our 20th year anniversary. And while we run core programs on blue carbon, curbing plastic pollution, studying ocean acidification, I think the thing that makes the Ocean Foundation most unique is that we provide fiscal sponsorship to on-the-ground projects, many of whom are international, academic, on-the-ground implementers, or scientists. And so we actually host over 50 projects across 25 different countries, which helps inform us on not just local issues related to marine conservation, but global issues. I also want to point out how timely this conversation is. Right now is the 5th session of the Intergovernmental Conference on Marine Biodiversity and Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction is being discussed, and updates to the National Convention on the Law of the Sea are being debated right now. This is a incredibly fortuitous time to be having this conversation with all of you today. I want to segment my brief remarks here today in 3 parts. The first is presenting some context around what we have as opportunities for the blue economy in the Indo-Pacific region. I want to talk about some of the challenges and barriers to implementing those solutions. And I want to conclude my remarks with some highlights on where these solutions are actually taking place and some bright spots that I think we can learn from. So taking a step back and looking at the opportunity in front of us, I think as was discussed yesterday, and I'm sure will be discussed again today, the ocean serves as one of the greatest opportunities for international diplomacy that we as human beings have. Even amongst countries that may not have the strongest formal diplomatic relations, the ocean is a great connector. And so if you think about the public commons, if you think about the ocean as a public resource beyond the 200 nautical miles outside of any country's jurisdiction is the high seas. And if you think about the ocean that covers 71% of the Earth's surface, you think about the high seas being 2/3 of the ocean, half of Earth relies on international cooperation and treaties. So this is critically important not only for this region, but it has global implications on how well we work together. The blue economy is a rapidly emerging sector that I'm sure many of you have heard a lot about, referring to the economic activities that occur in the ocean. And there have been real strides made in the Indo-Pacific region, primarily on the greenification of shipping ports, on making more fuel efficient vessels that burn less carbon, as well as waste to energy technology and large scale recycling. These are all sectors that the private sector is looking to invest in, but more recently, governments are looking to invest in. And so one of the sectors within the blue economy is something that is referred to as blue carbon. Now, blue carbon refers to using oceanic ecosystems to sequester carbon. And while it is true that some of these ecosystems, like seagrasses, salt marshes, and mangroves, which do play a critical role in the Indo-Pacific region, while it is true that they are remarkable at sequestering carbon, a healthy mangrove can sequester up to 5 times more per hectare than a tree in the Amazonian rainforest. So these are tools that we have at our disposal to fight climate change. I think the more important and germane point for this group is that they're actually critical for enhancing biodiversity and supporting local coastal communities in the region. One of the things that we have become particularly concerned about is that the coastal communities, and particularly the islands in the region, contribute the least to the problem of climate change, yet disproportionately face the brunt of its consequences. So when you talk about sea levels rising, when you talk about increasing storms in intensity and frequency, drought, these are all things that are having a disproportionate impact on these local coastal and island communities. And I'm sure Cornell and others are going to talk about national security issues. But when you talk about communities no longer being able to inhabit their own land, now you are talking about mass migration on the level that creates a national security issue I don't think any country is prepared to grapple with. In addition to the migration of peoples, we all know that culture is deeply rooted to place, to your community. And so one of the things we're also concerned about is while we come up with these adaptation strategies, we're not just talking about the migration of a country and its residents, we're talking about migrating their culture. And that is a whole other piece to this that we need to examine. However, there are real solutions to unlocking the blue economy and strengthening international cooperation. So, for every $1 that you invest in a coastal restoration project like seagrass, mangroves, or salt marshes, you get $15 back in net economic return. Now, why is that? Well, number one, these ecosystems are critical for local livelihoods. So, if you're a local fisher or you are a local tourism operator, you depend on having a healthy ocean ecosystem to support your livelihood. It is also critical to maintaining the maritime resources that these communities have, which is then critical to trade, to exporting those resources to other countries, and to also harnessing those resources locally. So I think one thing to note about what are some of the barriers around this. To really embrace the blue economy, to really invest in that, takes a shift in our normal thinking. We need to not think about how does this project impact us 6 months from now or 3 years from now, which is a lot of what governments are thinking about or funders are thinking about, a very short term thinking. We need to be thinking about ecosystems and partnerships that set us up for 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And that is the kind of regional planning that we would like to see, because when you look at where a lot of this work is taking place in, it is based on those ecosystems existing for a number of years. And so we actually believe that this is a critical opportunity for countries to invest in nature-based solutions. And one of the ways that the United States and India and other actors in the region can cooperate is on actually sharing the technical expertise and knowledge. There are not a lot of seagrass and mangrove experts in the world, and so this is a key place where our countries can work together. Another key tenet of this is that the local communities and the island communities that I mentioned must have a seat at the decision-making table. So whether it's COP27 or the United Nations Environment Assembly or any kind of formal negotiations, it is important that not only our countries' major urban centers are represented and the high level government officials are represented, but we must have that local perspective in the room. Because ultimately, the decisions that are made in Washington, D.C., that are made in India, that are made in China, are going to have impacts on all of these communities. And if their voice is not represented at the table, I think we're missing a key perspective that would actually inform better decision making when it comes to regional cooperation and how we share maritime resources. The last piece I want to talk about is the real opportunities for international cooperation. So we have all seen the scourge of plastic pollution. I'm just going to take plastic as one example because I think it serves as a really good example. Uh, and the national sword policy, when China said we are no longer accepting, plastic being shipped over from the United States, you need to figure out how to grapple with this on your own. What we saw was a real inequity, and particularly in the Indo-Pacific region and in Southeast Asia, where a lot of these countries without the infrastructure to deal with the world's waste are now grappling with this. And so at the United Nations Environment Assembly held in Nairobi in this February, 177 countries came together and agreed to a framework for a global plastics agreement. And they set a very ambitious timeline, a 2-year timeline. So in 2 years, they want to implement a framework that actually addresses how to eliminate plastic pollution globally. There are many of these agreements that are happening, and it shows real momentum. I think what we are advocating for, and I think what is germane to this conversation, is making sure that local voices are a part of those working groups that are being stood up now, and that island voices are in the conversation about how they can set up the infrastructure to grapple with these issues. So whether it is managing your own fish stocks, whether it is managing your own coastal resources or maritime heritage, we want to make sure that those voices are brought into the formal stakeholder decision-making process. And so this global plastics agreement, as well as the negotiations with BB&J, give us hope that there's real opportunity and momentum, even if countries do not have the strongest formal diplomatic ties, that NGOs, private sector, academia can come together and recognize that the ocean is a shared public resource in all of our public interest. So I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to say a few thoughts on this, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions during the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jason, for that compelling argument for why we should be doing much more together on this common resource that is at risk. I was on the mangrove issue. I was just going to say that I read a very interesting article just last week in the New Yorker about the mangroves in Florida and how incredibly fragile these ecosystems were, and that the research that goes into it is enormous. And so I think that what you mentioned about research, I think, is something that that we need to pay more attention to. But thank you. All right, our next speaker is Cornell, and he's going to shift a little bit focus onto the maritime governance and legal issues, and perhaps how you actually grapple with some of these cooperative and maybe conflicting approaches to the common resources. Cornell, welcome. Cornell, I think you might need to switch on your audio.
How about now?
Okay, got it.
Okay, excellent. Had to unmute on my phone and the computer at the same time, so not entirely intuitive, but we'll make it work. I just wanted to say, again, good evening or good morning, wherever you are. And it's such a great honor to be speaking at this final session of what seems to be a really productive and fruitful series of conversations connecting the American and Indian security spaces. So my remarks today will focus on maritime law and governance in the Indian Ocean region. In particular, I want to survey some of the major governance challenges and highlight ways that maritime law, and particularly maritime law between the intersection between the United States and India, can help address some of these challenges. I'll start by giving some background on how I approach international law, as well as the basics of the who's and where's of maritime law. Then I'll get into a few of the pressing governance challenges, highlighting what the challenge consists of, why it's a problem from a legal governance perspective, and what the United States and India could do to try and mitigate or overcome those challenges. So the approach I take to legal analysis is called or shaped by the New Haven School of International Law. The New Haven School developed as a response to classical realism as a theory, the classical realism of Hans Morgenthau and E.H. Carr in the 1940s. So like classical realists, these scholars who developed the New Haven School recognize that international law is shaped by state interests. But unlike realists, these scholars believe that international law nevertheless had normative power. So to Dr. Alpali's introductory remarks, right, we're talking about a blend here between a realist and normative approach to understanding how international law works on the international stage. They also recognized, those behind the New Haven School, they recognized that, well, power is important. It's not everything. And things like authority, which is normative, and other goods also matter to national leaders. So scholars adhering to the New Haven School tried to understand the world, but also change it. It's a very policy-oriented method that often proposes changes that try to reconcile the interests of those making international law, so predominantly states, but increasingly also non-state actors, with the goals of a safe and stable international order and increased human dignity. Let's turn briefly to the sources of maritime law. So the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or perhaps better termed, the Constitution of the Oceans, is the most important source of maritime law. It's where you go first when you have a question about maritime law. However, right, national laws are really where the rubber hits the road, because that is where you see what countries and how countries interpret UNCLOS. Again, it's not self-interpreting, it's not self-enforcing, so it really depends on how states interpret it. And as I'm sure you discussed yesterday, right, the U.S. and India have different interpretations on issues like military activities in the exclusive economic zone, right, and that's reflected in national legislation and the kinds of interactions that the U.S. and India have in the exclusive economic zone. Other several fora also contribute to maritime law. The United Nations, and as Jason mentioned, the current negotiations underway on biological diversity beyond national jurisdiction, the International Maritime Organization, regional fishery management organizations, the International Seabed Authority, right? There's a whole bunch of sort of a constellation of authorities that have jurisdiction. And then finally, states have assigned assorted multilateral and bilateral agreements and understandings that also impact how maritime law works in the flesh. As for the who of maritime governance, very briefly, I think it's useful to think about this in terms of jurisdiction and stakeholders, right? Jurisdiction is fairly clear in most cases, since it's spelled out in UNCLOS. These are the coastal states, the port states, the flag states, and certain international organizations, like I mentioned. Stakeholders, I think, is a much broader question, right? But we can generally say it's all the users of the ocean, as well as international organizations and civil society groups. I want to quickly turn to the where of maritime governance, because I think it's really crucial to keep in mind. UNCLOS divides the ocean into various zones, where coastal states and all the other states have different rights and responsibilities. So the territorial sea, which is closest to shore, is under coastal state sovereignty, but flag states have some rights with respect to the ships sailing under their flag in this zone. Between 12 and 200 nautical miles from shore, you have what's called the exclusive economic zone, where the coastal state has exclusive jurisdiction over economic extraction, research, and certain types of environmental preservation. But other states have stronger rights with respect to, say, navigation and, the U.S. would argue, military exercises. And then finally, beyond the exclusive economic zone and any extended continental shelf that exists below that are high seas and the area. So the area is the seabed, just the seabed, beyond the continental shelf, and is reserved as the common heritage of mankind, and economic activities there are under the purview of the International Seabed Authority. That's quite an interesting question, more of a Pacific question at the moment. High seas is all water beyond 200 nautical miles of shore, right? So extending the continental shelf does not extend the exclusive economic zone. That's an often a misunderstood point, but it's a really important one. The high seas under no state's jurisdiction, but ships and their activities are under state jurisdiction. So in general, the further you go from shore, the greater the common character of the ocean, and the greater the need for international cooperation. So I want to highlight 3 governance challenges in the Indian Ocean: governance zones, delimiting governance zones, fisheries, and piracy. Border delimitation is a core governance challenge because overlapping claims and unclear outer borders of the continental shelf make it impossible to know who has what jurisdictions and where. Delimitation creates clarity, right? And the Indian Ocean still has areas where maritime boundaries have not been delimited. I count between 7 and 9, depending on where you include and what you include. But this creates immediate governance issues because it affects rights to fish, drill for resources, and approve research. This is ultimately a matter for the states involved, and stakes can be high since we're talking about national boundaries. But if states embrace collaborative compromise in delimitation proceedings, they can make the governance landscape clearer and also unlock the international investment in economic activity based in the blue economy that can power their economies, right? So the U.S. and India, in my opinion, as 2 powerful states in the region, could serve as convening powers, leveraging their diplomatic power to encourage states to seek compromise and really make the blue economy a reality where unclear delimitation is impeding it at the moment. The other problem, which Jason mentioned, right, is sea level rise. And this creates another difficult governance problem in the Indian Ocean, as well as worldwide. So generally, a state's zones are driven by the low water line on shore. Sea level rise, as you'd expect, pushes that line back. And so the big question in international law, international maritime law at least right now, is how low water lines receding will affect the extent of the territorial sea and exclusive economic zone. At the extreme, right, we could be looking at whole islands or countries being submerged, for example, the Maldives. Legal experts in the UN International Law Commission are currently wrestling with the question, but I think this is another area where the U.S. and India could collaborate, informally at least, to support these experts' work. And then once they come to a solution, come to a conclusion about what the nature of the interaction is.
Cornell, I just have a quick question.
Sure.
Cornell, apparently you have visuals and it's not showing up. I'm sorry, I just saw the comment here.
Yes, I did try and share my screen, but didn't have that show up.
Okay, that's fine.
If that's possible to arrange, terrific. If not, no worries. I can go without it.
Okay, that's fine. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to clarify. Bye-bye.
No worries. Right, so the U.S. and India, I think, could serve as important countries in leading the charge to embrace whatever the findings of the ILC and their experts are with respect to sea level rise and international law. Fisheries, turning to fisheries, are another important governance issue, obviously. Like elsewhere, fish is a really important source of protein in the Indian Ocean region. Within the exclusive economic zone, coastal states have exclusive jurisdiction over fishing and can either limit fishing only to ships under their flag or sell licenses to major fishing states. And you find both in the Indian Ocean region. However, many states in the Indian Ocean also have large exclusive economic zones and limited capability in terms of maritime domain awareness and enforcement capability, right? The law doesn't matter very much if you can't identify where ships are breaking the law, and if you can't go intercept them when you figure out that they're breaking the law. So limited maritime domain awareness and enforcement capability are the real gaps here, right? It's not an issue of legal gaps, it's a matter of capability gaps. And so, but these could really, right, lead to overfishing at the most extreme that kills sort of the blue economy before it has the chance to really become an engine for growth. And additionally, while the limited boundaries where they exist are really clear on the map, right, fish aren't necessarily going to respect those lines and often straddle the exclusive economic zones of several countries and the high seas. And so this is, again, a classic commons problem that's ripe for overfishing. Governance rooted in international maritime law offers a partial solution in the form of regional fisheries management organizations. These institutions set, for example, annual fishing quotas in a specific area for the states that have joined the organization, but they aren't perfect. The quotas are often criticized as being too high for long-term sustainability. I'm sure Jason has some stuff to say about that. And in the Indian Ocean, the most important are the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission and the South Indian Ocean Fisheries Agreement. A 2019 report by some IUU fishing activists highlighted how these two organizations could improve their processes to improve monitoring for transshipment, boosting transparency of decision-making, and enforcing compliance. But the U.S. is party to neither, and India is only party to the Tuna Commission institution, not the broader one that covers every other species aside from tuna species. There's one prominent recent success that I want to highlight on the fisheries front, as well as two things that the U.S. and India could do to improve on the fisheries front. The success here is the Quad's rolling out of the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative, which will use satellite imagery and artificial intelligence to identify dark vessels that are trying to evade detection by, for example, shutting off their AIS transponders. Continuing to invest in shore-based NDA is also important, in my opinion. I know that India has done some of this investment in places like Mauritius. On top of that, I think India could really learn from the U.S. Shiprider program, which is a program where small states, particularly in the Pacific, sign agreements allowing their law enforcement to ride U.S. Coast Guard vessels patrolling the Pacific and enforce their national laws from U.S. government ships. As a rising state and really sort of one of the leading powers in the Indian Ocean, India will be a natural leader for implementing this kind of agreement, with Indian Ocean states struggling with enforcement. And then finally, I think stakeholders in civil society should encourage the U.S. and India to consider full membership in all Indian Ocean RMOs as a way to shape these institutions for the better. Finally, just briefly, piracy, it's down globally, particularly off the Horn of Africa, but it's not gone away entirely. And we've seen how changing economic situations can spur sudden spikes in pirate activity. So in addition to naval patrols, private maritime security companies are another important element in deterring pirate activity, particularly because they're a tool that private industry can use independent of major naval states committing warships to anti-piracy missions. The IMOs produce some guidance on how the states, ship owners, and coastal states should approach private maritime security contractors, but again, this is just guidance. So this creates some difficult governance problems because you get a patchwork of laws and regulations, right? As you'd expect, these contractors are usually armed, but they must comply with coastal and port state regulations in the territorial seas and ports. And then because many of the states in the Indian Ocean restrict or prohibit firearm possession, floating armories have sprung up as a workaround, right? These are ships that are positioned in international waters under the flag of states that have relaxed rules on stocking ships with significant quantities of arms and ammunition. But of course, this then creates problems and concerns about tracking those arms and ensuring that they're not funneled into the illegal arms trade or raided by pirates or terrorist groups. And then finally, on top of it all, there's the question of liability when things go wrong, as they did, for example, in 2012, when armed guards shot and killed Indian fishermen who were assumed to be pirates. So this incident, plus the history of terrorist attacks via the sea in India, and the general concentration of floating armories off India's coast over the past 10 years has made India one of the states most keen to seek increased control over the private maritime security industry. The limited state of piracy today means that figuring out a good international regime on private maritime security contractors and floating armories doesn't feel urgent. But it's two states with a high interest in these issues of combating piracy, but doing it in a responsible way that doesn't fuel conflict or heighten insecurity for coastal states. I think the U.S. and India could work together to push for an international agreement or standard that resolves some of these problems before either piracy returns or private maritime security companies cause fresh incidents. I'll leave it there. I know that was quite a lot, and I hope that some of it has been useful. And I look forward to the moderator's comments and the questions from the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cornell. You certainly did pack in a lot of extremely interesting material. And I have to say that what your presentation points to is the large number of international agreements and already existing frameworks and institutions for countries to play a greater role in. And secondly, the link between security and the commons domains, whether it's maritime domain awareness, for example, because we heard yesterday that that's one of the big areas where US and India are actually cooperating quite a lot on. But of course, that was from the security perspective. And I'd be interested during the discussions to go into that link a bit more. But now I have the great pleasure to turn the floor over to Abhijit Singh, who, Abhijit, take the full time, 12 to 15 minutes, and because you have a lot to respond to and also give your comments on. So,
thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gopali. At the outset, I'd like to thank Christ University and you, Dr. Deepa, for having invited me to this excellent conference. I was talking before the start of the conference that I actually attended yesterday's session, and I was so deeply enlightened by the discussions yesterday. I think there was a whole host of issues on the table, all of them very consummately handled by the speakers. And today, I think both Cornel and Jason have made some excellent observations. There's many issues on the table that they've just sort of pushed out. And I'm going to have to see how I'm going to handle so much. But you know, given my expertise, which exists on the intersection actually of security, of maritime law, and of non-traditional security issues, marine and maritime governance, what I might try and do is that I might try and just sort of draw out some strands from all of these areas and see where they cross. And I'm going to try and give a very authentic Indian perspective. I think what we heard from Cornel and Jason was more a sort of US view of how US policymakers, US scholars tend to view the maritime commons. But the picture here in India is just a little bit different, and I'm going to try and say something about that. But let me begin by recognizing a reality, which you know, just a few years ago, I didn't think too many people would sort of recognize, which is that the maritime discourse, just in the past about, about a decade, 10 years, has actually swung from traditional security issues, and I'm talking about South Asia and India, from traditional security issues to non-traditional security. And what we see now is that instead of those old, you know, questions about Chinese operations in the Indian Ocean, etc., which are still talked about, but what we see is, apart from all of that, we see a great deal of stress on non-traditional security issues, particularly human security issues. And there's an acknowledgement in academia, among scholars, among policymakers, that the seas cannot just be an arena of contestation between nations, that they have to be put to the use of mankind. You know, as Jason rightly mentioned, it's a global common, it's a heritage of mankind, and a sort of and a public connector. It connects people. So with that as a background, I think what's now being discussed ever more enthusiastically and with greater vigor is issues of growth, of conservation, of sustainability, of development, marine development, etc. So the one idea that now I get to hear quite often, and both I think Jason and Cornel have alluded to it, though they have not called it by the same name, is holistic maritime security that talks about not just about traditional elements of security, but also non-traditional elements and human security. In this, I think in India, there's a greater interest on the UNCLOS, the law of the sea. And I say this not just with regard to you know, the events that we see happen around the disputes in the South China Sea, but also deployments in the Indian Ocean. And as Cornel had mentioned, the incident of the Enrica Lexi, which is the Italian Marines firing and killing two Indian fishermen, that has also triggered a debate over what is India's position on the maritime law. And there are some gray areas there that we can talk about as we go along. But I'm going to come to another reality, which is that marine governance as an area in the Indian Ocean hasn't really succeeded in a way that was really hoped. And the reason I think for that essentially is that when it comes to rules, when it comes to law enforcement, and when it comes to investment in the maritime domain, South Asia really hasn't quite stepped up to the plate. Let me talk a little bit about rules. It is an accepted fact that the UNCLOS is the foundation. It sits at the very base of marine governance, marine and maritime governance. And it's a wonderfully detailed compendium of regulations. It guides maritime activity. It guides national policy and governance in the oceans. But from a purely tactical standpoint, I would argue that the UNCLOS has limited application in South Asia, particularly because there's a great deal of EEZs in the space. So the UNCLOS actually leaves the EEZs as a bit of a fuzzy space in regulatory terms. This is a region where both coastal states and user states, as Conal rightly pointed out, believe they have rights. They have rights and they have interests. And there's always a fight between coastal states and user states over who or whose rights take priority over the others. And the UNCLOS does not actually state very clearly whether user states have the same rights, even though they have high sea freedoms. Do they have the same rights as coastal states? The second issue is that the UNCLOS actually outsources a great number of governance issues to institutions and to instruments. Institutions like the regional fisheries management organizations, like the Seabed Authority, like the CLCS, and instruments like the CITES, the CMS, the CBD, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity. And so these instruments are really sectoral, and they have a very limited mandate. So in that sense, if you talk about the areas beyond national jurisdiction, that I think Jason alluded to, if you talk about that, there's really very few regulatory mechanisms there. There is no way in which these rules can actually be implemented because there is no regulator. There is no law enforcement agency in these places. And when we talk about the EEZs, these international rules don't apply because there's domestic regulation. And a large number of states have not bothered to align the domestic regulation with international law, by design or by purpose. That's just the way it is, that domestic regulation is in furtherance of national interests, but it does not align very well with international law. Similarly, if we take, for example, the question of investment, we find that marine governance requires massive investments. Think about cleaning off an oil spill, or dealing with marine litter, or talk about policing protected zones, dealing with illegal migration. All of this requires funding. And in South Asia, that funding has just not come by. Now, the issue is that governments in this part of the world believe essentially that blue economy, that again, Jason alluded to, is sustainable development, but it's more development with sustainability at the fringes. Whereas the truth of the matter is that blue economy actually is more sustainability. It's more sustainable activity. It's caring about communities. It's caring about livelihoods, and less of growth. So the growth element isn't as important in the blue economy concept as the sustainability element is. But governments in South Asia, and I can say this for the government of India also, has tended to emphasize on the harnessing of resources. And I would argue that that has also, to a degree, been the approach of the US. Think about it. One of the reasons why the US is not part of, isn't a signatory to the UNCLOS is because there was a huge issue in the 80s about the UNCLOS imposing, the perception that UNCLOS would impose restrictions on areas where seabed mining was happening. And the US was not willing to let go of those spaces where these restrictions would apply. And that's one reason why the US did not sign on to the UNCLOS. So, although it is a signatory, but it hasn't quite ratified the UNCLOS because of concerns around seabed mining. One could make the same argument for India to say that India's India's blue economy vision essentially is about harnessing again of fisheries, of resources, of minerals from the sea. And here again, UNCLOS hasn't helped us very much. So this brings us to the question of what is it that the US and India can do together. The first thing I'd like to point out is that the conversation between India and the US is generally weighted more in favor of traditional security issues. It's the Quad, the Malabar exercises, the equipment and the arms and the platforms that we buy from the US is generally what tend to hog the limelight and the conversation. I think there has to be a rebalancing here, and we've got to get maritime governance, issues of conservation, issues of biodiversity front and center. And that is going to take some doing, because traditionally India has not discussed these issues in bilateral settings. What India likes to do is discuss these issues in multilateral settings. For instance, a couple of years ago, I think in 2019, Prime Minister Modi proposed the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative that does talk about a lot about marine governance and biodiversity, etc. But in bilateral settings, India likes to focus more on the traditional issues of economics, of connectivity, of supply chains, and of security. So I think that conversation will have to be, as I said, rebalanced. Second, our differences when it comes to the UNCLOS, as Connell had pointed out. I think he rightly points out that we have our differences when it comes to the interpretation of key conventions or key features in the UNCLOS, and one of them is military operations in the EEZs. India is of the view that military operations are not permitted in the EEZs, whereas the US believes it has right of innocent passage through the territorial waters, and it can carry out military operations in the EEZs because the EEZs essentially are high seas. So I think we need, and there was an incident that happened about a year back off the waters of Lakshadweep that emphasizes our disagreements in this area. So I think that this is again one area that we need to work upon. The third area that we need to talk about is capacity building. I think India and the US should partner in the building of certain assets. You know, we're in an era where we are implicitly going to be challenged by climate events. We are, cyclones, hurricanes, rising sea levels, and what we might require are specialist and specialized equipment, boats, shallow water boats that can go out and carry out evacuation of people from risk-prone areas. So this is again one area where India and US have got to cooperate in building capacity. I think we've got to talk about transfer of technology. We need green technology. We need more efficient blue economy systems. We need a better sense of what we have to do with the question of fisheries, aquaculture, alternate energies, and small and smart tourism infrastructure. All of these issues are always there on the agenda when India takes up blue economy discussions with partners, but we still don't have a clear sense of who is it that can provide us with some tangible leads, some tangible technologies, so that we can have a better understanding of how we need to go forward when it comes to some of these issues. Fourth, I think climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies. It's something that really, as far as South Asia is concerned, exists only in the books. The truth of the matter is that when it comes to, for instance, hardening of ports and naval bases, not much work has been done. When it comes to decarbonization, again, there's the mitigation strategy, not much work has been done. Are we readying ourselves for a time when there will be sea level rise and a lot of cities are going to be endangered? Well, not quite. So again, in climate change is an area where really not much thinking has happened, and I think the US and Europe, two partners, can help us see the way forward when it comes to this area. Lastly, I would just point out that one of the key things with marine governance and resource conservation, etc., is to have these spatial planning zones. So you have marine spatial planning and these protected zones where all sorts of harnessing of resources is prohibited. And what we see in South Asia is that although there's talk, a lot of talk about protected areas, but not much movement forward. And I think with the help of the US, we could perhaps again have a greater sense of how we need to take what is it that that we can do in these areas. But to conclude, I will just say this: that we've got to place conservation and ecosystem maintenance front and center uh, of our bilateral conversation. At the moment, we have been discussing more of security issues, a lot of geopolitics, a lot of strategic balance of power, etc. But the way forward, I would think, is to rebalance that dialogue to have a more balanced approach towards both the governance, the commons area, as well as the security area, and also to ensure that what we say in terms of policy in marine governance is just not restricted to a declaration of noble intent. I think we need to take the conversation much further than that. We may not be able to do anything just bilaterally. This is a conversation that we need to have with a number of other partners, and particularly island nations that Jason pointed to. Island nations are the ones that bear the brunt, as he said, of what's happening in this space. And unless we don't take smaller island countries in the Indian Ocean, we don't accept them as stakeholders and partners in this relationship that we have with the US, there's very little movement forward that we can make in the domain of marine governance. So that, I think, in a sense, is where we are today. It's not a lot of positive news because we've done so little in the field of marine governance. But I think there are ways in which we can deal with some of these challenges that we are facing. It is going to take a long time to do it, but I think we've got to start taking the first steps towards moving in that direction. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abhijit. Giving precedence to maritime governance and ocean economy and sustainability, coming from a former naval officer, giving it precedence over the security issues, I take that very seriously. Let me just say that for the audience here, please go ahead and put in your questions in the chat box. We have a few, but right now, as you're thinking of putting in your questions, let me turn to a little conversation with the panel. I would like to point out that in one of the surveys we did for our group here, the young audience, when they were asked to rate their main areas of opportunities for US and India to work together, they actually put climate change and defense in equal importance, which, given the fact that there is so much conversation about the security issues, it is, I thought, quite eye-opening kind of finding here. Now, on the holistic economic and security and human security issues, I think that is something that, we have been hearing about for many, many years, actually, of course, as we know, and of course, tends to stay at that level of declarations. So what I would like to, and you've given us a lot of things to think about, and I would like to ask, if I would, at this point, something I did yesterday as well, I want to go around, starting with you, Jason, and say, given your own background and experience and what you've heard, in the India-US context and in where they can work together in the region, Indo-Pacific and Indian Ocean and beyond, what would be two of your top priorities in which they should take a lead? And secondly, in that, should India be taking the lead, or where does it have advantages to push for something in US? Where would you give the a more greater responsibility for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think where there is a real opportunity to cooperate is in terms of, so the United Nations has come out with the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy. And as part of that, they've put forth 5 official recommendations that countries around the world should be embracing. One of the things that we have seen on the conservation and international level that has worked really well to strengthen cooperation is the United States and other countries working together on their joint sustainability goals. In particularly, in the Paris Climate Agreement, which the US has recently rejoined, there's something called NDCs, naturally determined contribution. And so this is an area where these are measurable, quantifiable, and stated contributions that each government is pledging to make on an area of sustainability that advance our global and social and economic goals. And so I think where there's a real opportunity to cooperate is having the United States and India have a lot of the same language in their NDCs, putting blue carbon in there. And then I think where the United States can be helpful is that there is a lot of private financial capital here that can be deployed to help cover the infrastructure costs of many of these projects. So to launch a restoration project is at least hundreds of thousands of dollars, and in the United States, it takes about 2 years just to get it permitted. So if you want to do a mangrove project in the US, you have to not only put together your large-scale feasibility assessment, this is what I want to do in the areas I want to do it, you actually have to get that approved through the Army Corps of Engineers and likely the Endangered Species Act, which we've had to do many times. And so I think looking at that, there's a clear framework where you can streamline this, set the projects up, and then unlock a lot of the financial capital that exists in the United States, because many of our financial institutions are sitting on trillions of capital in the ESG space, environmental social governance, or impact investing. And there are no real rules of the road for ESG. It's very personal to what that asset manager believes is what their client is looking for to invest their money. And so if the United States and India cooperated more on these nature-based solutions, India could be identifying, here is a set of projects we would like to actually implement here in our region, and then here's a way that those financial markets in the United States can actually deploy that capital. And there's real interest to identify these projects, so much so that there are financial institutions in the United States looking at whether or not they can reduce your monthly premium payment on flood insurance policies if you have mangroves on your property, because that's how effective they are at preventing flood prevention, as one idea. So I think there's capital here in the United States. There's a lot of local knowledge to be learned from in India, and I think we need to connect those two and start catalyzing these projects, not just in the United States or in the Caribbean, but in the Indo-Pacific region as well.
Thank you. That's a very good suggestion, bringing together research and capital. I think that's a kind of a winning combination if you can line those things up. Cornell, what would be your 2 priorities that you think that they could work together, and which one has the advantages in what?
Certainly, yeah. So I think the first and sort of most immediate place for cooperation between the United States and India is fisheries enforcement. I think that the shipwriter program has been fairly successful in the Pacific. The U.S. is also implementing it in West Africa, but there are only so many U.S. Coast Guard cutters that the U.S. is going to be able to commit to these kinds of operations. And so this is where India can come in as a country that has, in particular, strong relations with a lot of countries in the region. That I think is an important asset, right? Because you're essentially, if you're a country that's signing a shipwriter agreement, you're turning over law enforcement to a certain extent. you're kind of relying on your bigger partner and bigger neighbor to help you enforce your laws. So having a good relationship, trust, all that is really important. And I think that's where, India as having presence in the Indian Ocean to a greater extent than the United States, and having a greater sort of inherent interest in regional fisheries sustainability, and then finally having a greater or stronger relationship with partners, really has the core essentials, right? And the U.S. in this case, I think, would really serve as a source of knowledge, right? A source of best practices from what the U.S. has learned through its many decades of running the shipwriter program. How India can structure that in a way that's going to be most effective and sort of skip the learning curve. As for a second suggestion or area to work on, I think that the clarification of maritime law, right, is really important. As Abhijit mentioned, right, there are points of disagreement. There are issues of interpretation. There are, issues with enforcement beyond areas of national jurisdiction, right? All of these things are challenges. They are things that the U.S. Has cut its own legs out from under it, right? By not having signed or not having ratified UNCLOS, right? So the U.S. really, in this case, needs to get its house in order when it comes to UNCLOS. It needs to finally ratify the convention so that the U.S. can be a stronger voice in trying to generate consensus and resolve these outstanding issues in the convention that were either fudged in the 1970s and 80s or have emerged in the decades since the treaty went into force. And really, that has to be something that the U.S. does from inside the convention, inside the treaty system, and that's just not there yet, right? But I think that if the U.S. is finally able to do that, India, right, will be a really important country to engage with, to try and find collaborative and cooperative solutions to outstanding legal issues, both because India has some key differing interpretations to the United States, but also given India's role and prominence in the sort of the non-traditional Western political world, right? So that I think is also really important because a lot of the fault lines in maritime law are between maritime states and coastal states, but also the traditionally developed states and developing states. And so there I think there's a really important connection to be made and cooperation to be had.
Cornel, if I could ask a follow-up on this, on the fisheries, the first point. You talk about trust as being very important in doing sort of cooperative monitoring and so forth. How do you see this bumping up against a country like China in the broader Indo-Pacific realm?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the key point here, right, is that these are resources that are by right the coastal states, right? If we're talking about fisheries, like improving fisheries enforcement in the exclusive economic zone for countries where they're currently concerned about IUU fishing, right? This is about securing countries, right to certain resources. And I think it then becomes a question of, right, who do you trust more to not steal your fish, right? And I know that China's illegal and unreported and unregulated fishing activities have generated concern, right? Those have been points of concern, particularly off Latin America. But, I think that is where India in particular can make a really strong case for being the partner of choice when it comes to shipwriter agreements and collaborative enforcement over China, right? Which has certainly made a name for itself as being a more irresponsible fishing nation that fishes at the expense of coastal states.
Great. Thank you. All right, Abhijit, just
Yes, I actually wanted to make a point on. Yes, no, actually, I just wanted to respond to a point on fisheries. You see, fisheries is one of the most vexing challenges in South Asia and the Indian Ocean at large. And the reason for that is that a lot of governments actually give subsidies to their fishermen and encourage deep sea fishing. And not only do they encourage deep sea fishing, they encourage destructive practices willy-nilly, like bottom trawling, sign net fishing. And what that does is that creates a very permissive environment for IUU fishing, as Connell has pointed out. Now, the reason why I think it's going to be hard for the US and India to begin to work together in this area is because the US has publicly opposed India's fishing policies in the WTO. In the WTO, India has taken a stand that it is entitled to give subsidies to the fishermen because it's a matter of livelihood. Whereas the West, there are a number of countries, Europe, the US, Australia, etc., they have all opposed this stand taken by the Indian government, as well as a number of other governments in the Bay of Bengal, to help their fishermen with gear and help them go deep into the seas, because the argument is that there are no fishes left in the coastal waters. They need to go deeper into the seas. But these fishermen, not only do they go deeper into the seas, they resort to such methods of fishing that destroys the sensitive ecosystems. And therefore, I think working on fisheries is harder said than done, because there's many areas of disagreement between the India and the US, even on that specific question of what to do with fishing resources. Also, a little point on raising of funding. I mean, I'm in agreement with what Jason has pointed out, that there is a lot of capital waiting out there to be unlocked. But the problem is that that capital can only be unlocked if the recipient country meets certain conditionalities. And in South Asia, a lot of these countries actually don't meet those conditionalities. The biggest problem is that India and a number of other countries don't really formally have a fishing industry. So if you have to give money to a partner, that partner isn't recognized as someone that is in the fishing sector. And it's very hard for that money actually to flow into the hands of an Indian recipient. Second, a lot of this capital actually wants a degree of transparency in what the recipient state or the recipient side will do with that money. And again, we don't quite really have the systems in place to have that kind of transparency and accountability about what's being done with that money. So in the past, for almost 10 years now, India has tried to access a lot of these funds in Europe. And we are often told that these funds are all waiting, to be unlocked and money to flow into India. But again, the money just does not flow in because Europeans and Americans, I would add, are extremely wary of investing in this part of the world, especially because a lot of this money is controlled by the private sector. And where the private sector does not see transparency, does not see accountability, and there is a suspicion that this money may be appropriated for other reasons, they are very reluctant to make those investments. So I think we've got to get into the weeds and see the nitty-gritty of why that cooperation and that conversation is not happening in these areas. But I thought this is just a sort of limited point that I want to make.
Sure. And Abhijit, the 30-second intervention on where you think they can work together, your top priority for doing that.
Look, I'm going to wear my naval officer's hat once again and say that maritime law is the first thing that we got to talk about. I think there are serious disagreements in the interpretation of those of the freedoms in the EEZs. And I would say that India and the US, they empathize with each other's concerns. The fact is, the US is a world power, and it simply has to operate in far-flung areas of the world. And the US military must have access to these spaces. So it makes sense for the US to follow a policy wherein it treats the EEZs as really open spaces, EEZs where there are high seas freedoms. And to be honest, the UNCLOS actually does permit those operations in the EEZs. But this has to do with the way in which the UNCLOS evolved in the discussions before 1982, when it was finally accepted as an instrument. And at that time, there were lots of differences between the West, seagoing powers, and the coastal states. India, China, Indonesia, they were all in one corner. The US, the UK, Netherlands, Australia, they were all in the other. And the argument was that what sort of permissiveness should be permitted in the EEZs. And The US was arguing, of course, for full high seas freedoms, and the coastal states wanted limited freedoms in this space. Now, uh, the UNCLOS has struck a balance, but I think we still need a conversation. And second, on capacity building, I think capacity building is an area where we can do a lot, especially capacity building among smaller states in South Asia. I just mentioned a few areas where we can work together. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And Jason, please take 30 seconds
Yes.
to give your input.
Well, I just wanted to respond because those were great comments that were just said. And one thing that really stuck out to me that was mentioned that I could not agree with more is conditionality. And that is the number one, I think, issue on getting the resources to the local communities who know how to best steward them and actually need them the most. And that is that whether it's private funding or even more stringent government funding, there's all kinds of red tape and bureaucracy rolled around that. It is highly restrictive and prescriptive on how that money can be spent. Oftentimes, countries are asked to put that money up front and get paid in a reimbursement fashion or match grants. And so I really appreciated the comments that were just said about the barriers around conditionality. And it's not just an issue in India, it is an issue worldwide. Even in the United States, in the continental United States, funders add all kinds of, I think, unnecessary and highly ineffective levels of conditionality on accessing funds. And I think most conditionality right now, when they talk about accountability, that is a myth. You can be highly accountable on where the money is going without overly prescribing how that community is going to use it. And you can streamline the way that groups can access these funds and still show accountability. And I think it's a way that a lot of Western funders are basically hiding behind this excuse to not deploy the capital to the places it needs. And they hide behind the barriers of grant applications and the red tape of accessing development funds. So that was a great point. And I believe that we need to remove those barriers of conditionality.
All right, I'm actually getting many questions now that I would like to turn to Cornell. If you want to just take very quickly a point, I'll let you.
Absolutely, yes. I just wanted to say that, Abhijit, you raised an important point on disagreements about the legality of subsidies and their legitimate policy purpose. But I do think that, again, shipwriter agreements are an area, they're a practical area where India, in its own sovereign capacity, can pursue agreements with other partners and close allies in the Indian Ocean, and simply learn from the United States in an informal capacity, which doesn't require solving the fishery subsidies issue as a first step before you can get to the shipwriter agreements. Thanks.
All right, let me now turn to some of these questions. This is for Cornell and Abhijit. The question is, why is China able to build islands in the South China Sea, and what maritime laws govern this? That's a good question. And also related to that, in some sense, is the fact that UNCLOS defines EEZ up to 200 miles, but that China is taking more and more of the said sea. And apparently there's some reports that it might start charging a fee from the ships passing through their claim 9-line. What can international community, if anything, legally or otherwise, do to force China to adhere to international law? So Cornell and then Abhijit, very quickly, please. I have a lot of questions.
Sure. Yes, that's a lot there. The short answer is to the first part of the question is that they can build these islands, these artificial islands, because they occupy the islands, and no one has forced them out, right? And the countries in the region probably will not do that, given China's military power. Legally, it entitles them to nothing. Right, many of these were not even islands; they were submerged features at high tide, which means that they are submerged features, meaning that they didn't have actual territorial seas associated with them. And so, China adding to them, making them actual islands that are above water at all times, doesn't actually change any status under UNCLOS. UNCLOS is extremely explicit about that. As to what the U.S. And the international community can do, right, this is where freedom of navigation operations come in, right? These are a policy tool that are designed to protest specific laws, right? They say, we don't agree with your legal interpretation and we're going to break the law, right? It's an act of civil disobedience, if you will, right? And so this is what the U.S. has done off the coast of allies and adversaries alike. And this is really what the international community, can do short of military options, is just say, we're not going to comply with this, and you can try and enforce it if you want, but, then you're the instigator of all this, right?
Abhijit, quickly.
Yeah, I think Cornel has answered this very well. China's policy really is a might is right policy. They are in possession of the islands, and because they're in possession, they can do the reclamation, both in the Spratlys and in the Paracel Islands. And in 2016, the Arbitral Tribunal actually criticized China's approach to reclamation, and also the fact that it was causing a large-scale destruction of ecosystems, etc. But China has just shrugged off that criticism, and it simply does what it can. And so the Chinese approach really in the South China Sea is to control that littoral, because it is at the core of China's interests. So there's very little that the international community can do at the moment to push China back. It possesses those islands. It has militarized those islands in a way that it can exert its influence, as also it can project its power in the South China Sea. And at this moment, I think it's best if the international community just waits and watches the situation and does not do anything that precipitates a conflagration or a confrontation with China, especially given what's happening in Taiwan for the moment.
Is there any possibility they may start charging fees for ships passing through their claims?
So the Chinese recently came up with a new Coast Guard law, and as a sort of as an attached provision to that law is that they have warned the international community that they might charge a fee for ships, but of course it's not been implemented as yet, and they're sort of just using this as a card to exert to sort of throw out a threat out there that if you will follow a policy that is anti-China, if you will try and contain China, and if you will try and counter Chinese moves in the region, then we might actually cover the fee. It's a way of showing that we control the space, but I don't see how they can implement it, because that is certainly not going to be acceptable to a number of user states, because the South China Sea really is an international space, and it certainly does not belong to China. So yes, the threat is there, but I don't think it'll be implemented.
I'm going to ask two questions for Jason and Cornel. And Cornel, you can answer your point in this question because it's connected about the fees. So to Cornel, question, how can piracy be governed when states like China actually promote some of this? There's some alleged fishing militias in the South China Sea. They arm them and they engage in privacy-like activities. So how can that be? And also the other question that you wanted to respond to. And one to Jason, question, in the wake of climate threats, some countries like Kiribati are buying land from Fiji and relocating its citizens to other countries. Do you think this is a good strategy to combat the rising sea levels due to climate change? And is this feasible in the long run? Cornel, why don't you take the...
Sure. So just to quickly highlight, and I think this kind of relates to the piracy question, the other reason that China may step away from the fee charging policy is that, currently the maritime law order makes that forbidden, right? You can't charge tolls just for passing through. It has to be for services rendered. As China becomes a more maritime nation, right, it doing certain things like charging fees in the South China Sea may become unpalatable because it opens the door to others doing that elsewhere, right? So that is I think, an important point to highlight, is that as countries become maritime states, right, and you saw this with the USSR, leading up to UNCLOS 3, right? And that shift really actually made UNCLOS 3 possible. Their interests change, right? And what they care about changes. And so, as China builds up its blue water navy, we may see its interpretations on certain issues of international law change. Whether they'll, adapt accordingly at home is another matter, right? They might be quite hypocritical about things, but their actual interests abroad, I kind of expect those to change. As for piracy, right? I don't see the maritime militias as meeting the definition of piracy under UNCLOS, right? That treaty and U.S. interpretation of it is standard. They're not engaged in piracy, right? They're engaged in coercive measures, but it doesn't meet the standard definition of piracy, which is a non-governmental private ship, predating on other vessels on the high seas. It just doesn't quite meet that standard. So, luckily we can still address piracy without having to be sidetracked by what's going on in South China Sea.
And Jason.
Yeah, so this is a real issue. It is far from ideal. It's hard to see the relocation being a long-term feasible solution. However, if you talk to countries, particularly the atoll islands in the Pacific, and you try and say, oh, what do you think about mitigation strategies to climate change? They will say mitigation went out the window 10 years ago. We are in adaptation. Climate change is here. We have to wrestle with this now. And many of the atoll islands are actually building physical elevated structures on their islands to accommodate for this, or relocating altogether, which has massive implications not only for the logistical challenge of relocating an entire group of people, but again, what are you doing to the culture? Are you leaving that culture at that place? How are you bringing that with you? And then it has real national security issues when you talk about how will the rest of the world handle a massive influx in migration around the world. So this is happening right now. People are relocating, and it speaks to the urgency of us addressing climate change as a global threat and recognizing that the effects are here. So it's hard to see this being feasible, but countries are grappling with this right now, and they no longer see their island as being inhabitable even 20 years from now. And that's a real decision they're having to make. I think one of the things that is encouraging is that if you allow the ocean to essentially restore itself, if you give it a reprieve, whether it's looking at fish stocks that have come back, or you look at ecosystems that have returned to abundance, you can actually bring these ecosystems back to their optimal levels. So it is a very serious and dire issue, but there's also a real silver lining on how we, if we address this right now, these ecosystems can come back. But it is happening. People are being forced to relocate. Absolutely.
Thank you, Jason, for throwing us a line of hope there on regeneration of the oceans, at least. I think this panel has been a perfect way to bring our overall project to a close, because it really is focusing on issues that affect human security at the same time that it is also involved in real national security issues as well. We just have a few minutes left, and as usual, we have too rich of a discussion and too little time to do it in. I just want to step back for a moment before I hand it over to Father Joes, just to make a couple of comments about some takeaways from the overall project in very short order. We'll be presenting this much more well-formulated set of conclusions in the future in reports. But, three things that I want to just point out. One is that what I've noticed across the discussions now and before is number one, the rising expectations between U.S. and India in their cooperation. And, whether it's specifically India wanting more technology, U.S. wanting more diplomatic support at the global level, I think it's a good thing because what it shows is that we have come to a point where we really have higher expectations of each other. And I think that is going to become, a moving target, which is a good thing rather than having low expectations. We have the highest expectations from our closest friends and family. The second point is shared values. One of the things that we started off looking at was the role of shared values. And what is clear is that the United States puts a lot of emphasis on democracy and shared values in their international relations. India, even though its national identity as the largest democracy is very, very important, does less of that. But at the same time, what I also keep hearing is like-minded countries and cooperation. That is brought together by democracy, and it's something that the national identity will not be able to just, it will always be there, that I think softens any other challenges that could come in the way. And last, let me say that I think India and the United States have a special and unique relationship on the global stage because India is an aligned country, but not an ally. And as we heard yesterday, the US is learning to live with that in very interesting ways. And I think that's a new model, perhaps, going forward. So I see great scope and hope in cooperation going forward. And with that, let me ask Father Jose for his valedictory comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Deepa, for steering the session so wonderfully. Now, it's indeed our honor and privilege to invite Dr. Father Jose Ceci to deliver the valedictory address. Briefly, Dr. Father Jose Ceci is the Pro Vice Chancellor and Professor, Department of International Studies, Political Science and History, Christ University. He is also the Director, Students Affairs at the university. He is a noted expert on maritime history. He is also a member of both Indian History Congress and South Indian Congress of India. He has authored or co-authored 4 books and numerous peer-reviewed articles on wide-ranging issues and presented papers at both national and international conferences. Apart from history, Dr. Father Jose is well-versed in theology and philosophy. He is a passionate teacher and an able administrator. We are all eager to hear from you, Father. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Manoharan. Dr. Alisa, Dr. Deepa Ollapalli, Admiral Arun Prakash, Dr. Lisa Kutis, Mr. Jeff Smith, Mr. Jason Donofrio, Mr. Cornel Overfield, Mr. Abhijit Singh, my colleagues at Christ University, Dr. Manoharan, Dr. Madhumati, other professors, and also from other partner institutions. My dear students and scholars of Christ University and other universities and think tanks, good evening and good morning for those who attend from United States. It is indeed a privilege and honor to deliver the valedictory address for this culminating conference, Regional Architecture for Partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, the role of US and India in security and commons, that we are hosting in collaboration with George Washington University. We had a series of conferences, seminars, and roundtables as part of the project on shared values and worldviews in US-India relations, promoting opportunities for cooperation, supported by the Department of State of United States. As a collaborating university, we are glad to note that the project went beyond its stated objectives for a half a dozen of reasons. On one side, it brought experts of US and India together. I personally felt that these collaborative and enriching deliberations over the past several months would not have been possible without this project. Various academic activities under the project immensely educated a larger audience, especially younger scholars, on various aspects of US-India relations like Indo-Pacific, public health, supply chains, media technology, political values, soft power, cyber security, defense, and terrorism. As I was going through the statistics, over 2,000 participants from various parts of the world benefited by the academic activity. Notably, the project looked at the bilateral relations between the oldest and the largest democracies away from the usual Delhi-centric perspective. Our department is part of the larger international studies and China studies network in the country. We have been constantly striving to advance the domain in the country and beyond. Most importantly, the project was instrumental in building capacity of several of young scholars through carefully thought out student panels and workshops. We at Christ University place a lot of emphasis on molding young minds so that they could make an effective contribution to the society in a dynamic environment. I can confidently say that this project undoubtedly contributed immensely in that direction. To appreciate, the project has led to several publications in the form of reports, especially by the students. I hear that more publications are on their way, and thanks to the rich content generated by the various discussions and surveys by this project. Crucially, the project brought about very succinctly the thinking and perspectives of younger demographics on pressing issues between US and India. Such inputs gave us good pointers for the future policymakers. Various events conducted under this project also got wide publicity across the world. I profusely thank and extend our heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Deepa Ollapalli, Director, Rising Powers Initiative, for leading this project successfully despite various pandemic-related challenges and despite the time differences between India and US. Dr. Deepa, in a special way, we thank you for your gracefulness to invite Christ University to be part of this collaborative effort. Thank you very much. I need to especially mention two of our faculty members, Dr. Manoharan and Dr. Madhumati, and all other colleagues in our Department of International Studies, Political Science, and History for their kind of leadership. It is the continuous effort and communication and networking of Dr. Manoharan and Dr. Madhumati that made the project successful. Except for the pandemic, I hoped we could have more offline sessions. I'm sure Dr. Deepa will make it possible through some other projects or whenever you visit Bangalore. In a special way, let me also thank all the resource persons in all the sessions, mainly in these 2 days. I could see the kind of seriousness and the depth of the discussions due to the high level of their scholarly achievements. Thank you very much, all the resource persons. Let me say, we are more glad to collaborate with both the Department of State and the George Washington University again in the future. In a special way, let me also thank Dr. Alisa, the Dean of Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University. Thank you to each and every one of you. Have a nice day and have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Father, for that excellent address. I think that's the right way to close the proceedings of the project. Now I request Dr. Madhumati, coordinator of the department, to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Manoharan, respected Father Jose, Pro-Vice Chancellor, Christ University, Dr. Deepa Olapalli, project head and our collaborator here. Speakers for today, Mr. Donofrino, Dr. Donofrino, Mr. Abhijit, and Mr. Cornell Overfield. Thank you for joining us all this today for the concluding session of this conference. As Father already pointed out, we've had a long collaborative project with Dr. Deepa Olapalli, which started off 2 years back. And after many of these sessions and 5 sessions, we are now coming up to the concluding session. And I cannot tell you how enriching the experience has been for both our students and for the faculty. We do talk about India and US relations in our classes, and our students talk about this, but coming from the American think tanks and experts from the United States, who Dr. Deepa was easily able to get for these conferences and roundtables, it has been it's been more of an enriching session because of the American input that has coming in. It's not just about reading it in the books, but actually discussing it with them. And our students were able to discuss, with the experts in the field. And thanks all of this to Dr. Deepa for being able to organize this in such a great manner. And not only this session today, but the session yesterday, and for the last 2 years that we have been talking to her. She did visit a couple of times to Christ University, but wasn't for one of these sessions. And as Father pointed out, we wish we could have had one of the offline sessions, and it would have made it much more interesting for our students. Both for the Indian experts that have come to the different programs here on our session, I wish to thank my own colleague and director for Center for East Asian Studies, Dr. Manoharan. He has been the one that has held the fort on the Christ University side. A number of calls, number of messages, and evening meetings, late evening meetings, and he's been the one who's been working hard at this project. And it's like finally he's becoming free of this project and he can take on more of these. So thank you, sir. Thank you for holding the fort, and thank you for all of your networking and for the number of hours that you have put in for this project. I also wish to thank all of the resource persons today. It has been wonderful. Of course, yesterday's national security issues and security and maritime security issues were important. But personally, I feel more, enriched by the discussion that we had today, that we can move on beyond national security and maritime security, and we can go beyond all of this and actually discuss the commons, which is very rarely discussed in many of the conferences. So thank you very much for all of you for bringing this perspective into India-US relations, especially in the Indo-Pacific. Our students have been excellent in participation and in asking questions. I know there are many questions that we have not been able to answer, but I'm sure they took away a lot from the discussions that happened here and in the previous sessions as well. And students also have been coordinating, making posters. They've been, putting up the slides and helping us with, sending out invitations, and student volunteers and our alumni who have been participating. Thanks to all of you for making this a wonderful success. And we hope that we will have more of these collaborative projects with George Washington University and with all the resource persons as well. Thank you, and have a good day and a good evening. Thank you.